if I asked you right now, what is your podcast responsible for? Not who is it for, what is it about, not what you hope it becomes, but what is it structurally responsible for inside of your business? Most podcasters don't know how to answer that question. Not because they're careless, but they actually never sat down and decided what that looks like inside of their business. When the role of your podcast is not defined, everything can feel exploratory. So I want to talk about what it really means to understand and decide the role of your podcast today. Most podcasters don't grow because they don't have a strategy. No more. Welcome to the show, Podcast to Grow, where I help coaches and entrepreneurs turn their podcast into their most powerful business tool. I'm Elena, and I'm breaking down exactly how to get more listeners, more impact, and more sales. Let's get into it. Before we talk about growth, before we talk about monetization, before we talk about visibility, strategies, and tactics, there is a simple decision underneath it all. What role does your podcast play? When that role is unclear, the podcast often feels exploratory. Episodes drift because you're trying out different things often. Calls to actions change. Positioning slowly shifts and drifts. Messaging is not clear throughout your episodes. The marketing outside of the podcast does not mirror what the podcast is doing anymore because the business has evolved, but the podcast has not quite done that yet. And so at this point, natural questions start to arise. Like, should I niche down? Should I broaden and widen my niche to capture more of an audience or a different type of audience? Should I sell more? Should I sell less? Should I be pivoting into something else and just changing my whole podcast and premise? These moments and thoughts and questions can feel very strategic, but they usually are symptoms of the underlying issue. The real question underneath it all is, what is this podcast responsible for inside of your business? The strategy cannot stabilize and compound until you name the role that you are trying to work towards. Recently, I had a conversation with a podcaster, and what she said to me stopped me for a second. She was saying that about every 6 months, she was changing things in her podcast. She would change the format of her podcast, or she would be changing the description because she felt like it didn't fit her any longer or fit where she was in her business. She was also changing the kinds of guests that she was bringing on. She told me that she was niching a little bit more in her guest space, and that felt clearer to her, but she still felt like her positioning was not being strategic in her podcast. And I was seeing that she was making these changes, and these subtle shifts was breaking what she was trying to build and compound on top of. And it wasn't that she didn't have a lack of ideas or tactics she was trying. It was that she wasn't understanding the role that her podcast was playing. In order for it to work or for it to actually compound, she needed to name what that role was. She was going based off of the metrics she was seeing or the engagement dips she was seeing. So she was adjusting according to that instead of maybe sitting with something for a little bit longer or really deciding to go all in one area at a time for her podcast. She was thinking that the issue was the podcast, but it really was that the role wasn't decided first. So every engagement dip felt like she had to make a change just so that she could keep up. And that's not how I see podcasts really working for a business owner. It should make your business easier, not heavier. Most podcasts start out in the exploratory phase. You launch it, you start thinking out loud, you start finding your voice, your core ideas, and you start to see what is resonating with your audience. And that stage is totally normal for podcasters. And most podcasters go through this phase, but they actually never evolve from that point. And because they never evolved, their expectations start to evolve. And they start to think that the podcast should be generating them leads, getting them revenue, building their authority, and bringing in opportunities for them. But because they never named a role or decided a role, their podcast stays in that exploratory phase and it doesn't evolve. And that mismatch is so frustrating. And this is where a lot of podcasters start to feel stuck and think that their podcast has failed because it is not moving forward the way that they expected. I've talked to podcasters that are right here in this spot. They're most likely about 2 years in, and they are sitting with hundreds of episodes and thinking, what is going on? Why has my podcast not moved from the place that I wanted it to move or doing anything that I want? They actually think most likely that it is an audience issue, that they haven't found their audience yet. They think that they need to maybe pivot a little bit more or go more general just so that they can start to hit the right audience. And then their podcast will start doing what they had hoped it would do in the first place. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. It's actually knowing the role of the podcast and deciding what that is and moving forward from there instead of trying to guess or stimulate what your audience actually wants. Often expectations grow faster than the structure does. Let's talk about when the podcast role meets the expectation. So podcasts fall into a few different primary roles, and I want to discover each one with you. The first one role is visibility lever. The purpose of this one is to build expansion. The job is exposure. And you measure this from reach, discoverability, collaborations, and audience growth. What it is not optimized for is high-ticket conversions or deep positioning. The next role is authority engine. The purpose of this one is reinforcement. This is when you are talking about the same core idea in multiple different angles. You measure this one with recognition, language adaptation, audience repeating your ideas back to you. So the signals that people will say is, I understand how you think, and I feel like you see me and understand what is going on in my head as well, because they see that recognition. The next role is the nurture system. The purpose of this one is decision support. The podcast warms them up to a specific offer or having them make a closer decision to working with you. You measure this one by conversations, inquiries, conversions. You don't measure this by reach spike or a download spike. Different roles create different expectations. I've seen podcasts that are doing something very powerful structurally. And this is most likely when I see an authority engine podcast. The host is saying things in multiple different angles. Their audience is starting to pick up their language and say it back to them. They're feeling seen, but they're still questioning, where are the leads? Where's the revenue? Why is this not working? So in their eyes, their podcast is not successful. And they're discouraged because they feel like their visibility is dipping or their downloads aren't quite where they want it to be. You know, they feel like they should be sponsored, but they don't know how that's even possible. And this is because there's definitely a mismatch. If the role and the metrics don't match, your podcast will always feel like it is failing and it's unsuccessful. As you can see, this is where things start to collapse for a podcaster. Many of them try to do everything simultaneously: exploration, visibility, conversions, authority, all in one show, and sometimes all in one episode. When 4 roles are competing, nothing can compound because your audience doesn't understand what they're going to get next. And so that can actually break trust. They don't know what to follow, what call to action they should do, or what you will bring them next time you come on the mic. And yes, one episode can have many outcomes, but you cannot prioritize all of them all at once equally. Sometimes when I listen to podcast episodes, I can hear right away when I'm listening to a show and the role changes within the one episode. So here's what happens. They most likely open with something inspirational, then they go into authority teaching, and then they end with a sales pitch. And none of these things are wrong individually, but when they are competing within one episode, it is hard for that episode to compound because the listener is left thinking, what should I be doing? Should I be feeling inspired? Should I be understanding the teaching in this episode? Should I be taking a certain action? Or should I be ready to listen and hear about this offer? What should I be doing at this point when I'm listening to this episode? When the role shifts constantly, the listeners are unsure what they should be doing next and how they can actually relate to the show and apply it within what they do. Clarity for the listener comes from consistency of the role. When you start to see that mismatch in your expectations versus reality, you start to clearly see how this affects your podcast. And from there, you can't unsee it. So if there is a podcast that is exploratory, but they are expecting conversions, you're gonna not have clear results because your podcast is still stuck in that role. Same with the visibility lever. If you are looking to be known and seen very well in your industry, then you're not going to get what you want from a visibility role podcast. You're going to be disappointed. And if you are using your podcast to nurture and you are expecting to be able to look at metrics and change and pivot and make those micro shifts and have them work, then you'll be disappointed because you'll keep thinking that your audience isn't grasping what you're doing because you aren't measuring the right thing. The role sets the expectation and the expectation shapes the strategy. And I want to be honest because there was a shift even in this season of my podcast. When I set out to start my podcast this season, I thought it was going to be all about podcast growth tactics, how to fix your ROI problems, podcast audits, and how to generally fix a podcast that is stuck. But over the years, I have started to see patterns from conversations with my clients, working with my clients, and conversations with podcasters in general. And I started to notice every stuck podcast had a similar issue. The role of the podcast had never been decided. So therefore, there was a mismatch in what the expectation was and what the podcast was actually doing. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. And so I had to move away from just talking about podcast tactics because what's underneath the show and the role is so much more important to get right before you start to add those tactics. Those tactics can start to move things for your podcast, but they will not work completely until the role has been decided. So the question I ask podcasters now is, what role is your podcast playing inside of your business? Sometimes the role only becomes clear after you start to see the pattern. And once you start seeing that, you start to see it everywhere and you can't unsee it. Okay, so I want to ask you right now, what is your podcast actually doing inside of your business right now? Not what do you hope it's actually doing, but what is it actually doing? Is it clarifying your ideas, keeping you visible, building authority in the areas that you want it to, warming people up to your offers or moving towards working with you? Or is it just existing? There is no shame in that answer, but there is power in naming what it is doing right now. Once that role is named, your podcast starts to feel lighter. You start to stop second guessing what you're doing, and everything is moving simpler and easier for you because you understand the role that it's playing and the job that it is doing. You no longer have to be thinking about what kind of changes you need to make, what kind of metrics you need to think about tweaking. You aren't concerned with downloads as much as you were before because your podcast is actually doing the job. And your job becomes reinforcing that job. And as you can tell, many podcasters have skipped this step. They usually jump straight into, how do I grow my podcast? How do I monetize it? How do I optimize it to run on its own so I don't have to really do much? But strategy built on an unclear role eventually collapses and does not compound. If this episode is helping you realize that you never formally decided on a role of your podcast, then that is probably the missing layer that you need. I created a short diagnostic guide to help you with this. It is called The 3 Signals That Your Podcast is Structurally Under Leveraged. Inside, it looks at 3 different signals. Authority is not expanding. Revenue is not connecting. The show is published without a defined structural position. Because most podcasts don't stall because of bad content or fail because of bad content. They fail because the role was not decided. You can find this diagnostic in the link underneath the show description. So just go under the title and you'll find it right there in the show description. And when you open it up, go through it slowly. Start to recognize what your podcast is actually doing. Identify where you might need to make changes. Start to identify what it might be optimized for and what it is not. Because your podcast is not just content and it's not just consistency. It's actually a business decision. And when you start treating it like it, everything about how you approach it starts to change. Next week, I am going to close out the season, and we are going to take a bird's eye view of the whole picture of your podcast. Because once you start to notice that effort and doing and tactics is not the problem, you start to realize what is. You are left with a bigger realization. Your podcast is a business decision, and that changes everything. I'll see you there. If today's episode has you questioning whether your podcast has a direction or not, I have something for you. If your podcast has been active for 6 to 12 months, but it isn't influencing authority, revenue, or bringing qualified leads your way, that isn't effort. It's structure. Most business owners try to fix this with better content, stronger call to actions, or more visibility. But without defining the podcast's primary responsibility inside the business, effort multiplies without compounding. This diagnosis will help you identify whether authority is plateauing, whether revenue is disconnected, whether positioning is undefined, because you can chase tactics, but it will never clarify the role of your podcast for you. You'll find the link to this guide in the episode description.